Before the sun clears the tree line, she is already moving. Not stretching, not easing into the day the way we might imagine someone does when the world is wide and unhurried. She moves because the fire needs feeding, because the water bucket sat empty since last evening, because the chickens don't wait and neither does hunger. The light outside is barely gray, the air carrying that particular chill of the Great Plains in early autumn, not cold enough to be cruel, but cold enough to remind you that comfort is never guaranteed. The cabin floor is rough-hewn wood, wide gaps between the planks where the wind has its own opinion about privacy. Her feet know this floor by feel. She doesn't need a lamp to navigate it. The smell of ash still in the stove, the faint ammonia of the chickens just outside the wall, the particular thickness of air in a closed space where several people have been sleeping. This is morning on the frontier. This is where we begin. This is the American frontier of the 1880s, not the one spun from dime novels and painted onto theater posters, not the world of gleaming revolvers and clean-shaven heroes standing in golden dust at high noon. The real frontier is this: a woman in her late 20s, or perhaps her early 40s, because the sun and the work make the difference hard to read, pulling a wool dress over a linen shift that hasn't been properly washed in 2 weeks, cinching it at the waist not for fashion, but because loose fabric catches on everything, on fence posts and cook stoves and the rough bark of firewood. Her hair goes up fast, pinned without a mirror, because there is no time for mirrors. By 1880, the frontier had pushed deep into what would become Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and the Oklahoma and Indian territories. The Homestead Act of 1862 had been drawing settlers westward for nearly 2 decades, promising 160 acres to anyone willing to claim it and work it for 5 years. What the government posters did not advertise was the reality of those acres, often flat, treeless land where the nearest neighbor might be 3 miles off, and the nearest town, with its general store and its single-room post office, might be 12. For women who came west with their husbands or brothers or fathers, and for those rare few who came alone, this was not an adventure. It was a long negotiation with survival, conducted without arbitration and without exits. The morning routine, if you could call it a routine, was less a schedule than a sequence of physical necessities performed in rough order of urgency. Fire first, water second, then animals, then food, then whatever labor the particular season demanded. In summer, that might mean tending a kitchen garden from which much of the family's sustenance would come, hoeing between rows of beans and squash while the sun was still low, before the heat made bending over the earth genuinely punishing. In winter, it might mean fighting through snow just to reach the outhouse, positioned far enough from the cabin to manage the smell, close enough to reach without frostbite, though the line between those two requirements was sometimes badly miscalculated. In spring, it meant mud, the pervasive, boot-swallowing, wheel-stopping mud that made every task take longer and left a permanent gray-brown tide mark on every hem within a foot of the ground. Water deserves its own reckoning, because in the modern world we no longer understand what it means to work for water. On the plains, many homesteads drew from a well dug by hand, sometimes 30 or 40 feet deep before hitting a reliable aquifer. Pulling water up meant a rope, a wooden bucket, and a windlass, and it meant doing it multiple times a day, for cooking, for the animals, for washing dishes, for the rare occasion of bathing. On dry stretches, wells ran shallow or bitter. Some settlers hauled water by barrel from a creek half a mile distant, loading the barrel onto a wagon, driving out and back, unloading it bucket by bucket. Every drop that entered the cabin represented labor, which meant every drop was accounted for. You did not rinse your coffee cup under a running tap. You poured a careful measure into a tin basin, wiped the cup with a rag, and moved on. Bathing in the popular imagination of the frontier gets passed over quickly or romanticized into something involving a painted tin tub and scented soap. The truth was considerably less scenic. A full bath, meaning something approaching a complete washing of the body, might happen once a week for women in more established frontier households, or considerably less in poorer or more isolated ones. The logistics alone were daunting. Water had to be hauled, heated over the stove and iron kettles, poured into whatever basin or wooden tub was available, used quickly before it cooled, then hauled back out again. This was not a restful ritual, it was work added to an already exhausted day. More commonly, a frontier woman cleaned herself in sections, hands and face in the morning, feet and neck when opportunity allowed, using a cloth and a small basin that might be reused multiple times before it went cold and gray with use. Hair washing was a separate and infrequent event, requiring its own supply of warm water and the better part of an afternoon to dry properly near the stove. The smell of a frontier settlement in the 1880s is something the historical record understates with extraordinary consistency. Think about what occupied the average homestead. Horses and oxen, their manure compacting in the barnyard through all weathers. Pigs, if the family was fortunate enough to keep them. Chickens, whose domestic odor is both earthy and sharp. Inside the cabin, the smells layered differently. Smoke from the iron stove, which never fully left the fabric of anything. Curtains, clothing, hair, the rough wool of blankets, the rendered lard used for cooking, damp leather boots set near the fire to dry, sweat because bodies working hard in wool clothing in warm weather produced it in quantity, and that wool held it for days. The outhouse, which on warm afternoons made its presence known well before you reached it. None of this was considered shameful or remarkable. It was simply the atmosphere of living. People adapted without necessarily noticing. Clothing on the frontier was a practical problem first, and aesthetic consideration only distantly. A frontier woman typically owned 2 or 3 dresses, one for everyday work, one slightly better kept for town or church, and possibly a third in some state of repair or disrepair. Wool in summer was hot, scratchy, and held odor tenaciously. Cotton was cooler, but wore through faster and provided little warmth in the shoulder seasons. Undergarments, a linen shift worn close to the skin, petticoats layered over each, added warmth in winter and trapped heat in July with equal effectiveness. Stockings were wool, hand-knit by whoever in the household had the skill and the time, darned repeatedly at heel and toe before being replaced entirely. Shoes were worn until they fell apart, resold when possible, replaced reluctantly because leather goods were expensive relative to the average frontier household income, and a trip to the cobbler meant a trip to town, which meant a full day lost to something other than work. The job of laundry was a day-long event, not a chore that slipped neatly between other tasks. It required heating large quantities of water, soap made from wood ash lye and animal fat, or purchased in bars at considerable expense, a washboard, a wooden tub, and the considerable physical effort of scrubbing, wringing, and hanging cloth in weather that might cooperate or might not. Frontier accounts suggest laundry day was genuinely dreaded. The work left hands raw from lye and cold water, the wringing was hard on the lower back and shoulders, and the results were often imperfect regardless of effort. Heavy wool never quite lost its smell of use. White cotton went a steady ivory gray no matter what you did. Stains from grease, blood, garden soil, and animal matter were addressed with varying success. Some things just stayed stained and you wore them anyway. The iron cook stove dominated the interior of most homesteads, not just as the instrument of every meal, but as the primary source of heat, the center around which the entire domestic day organized itself. Cast iron stoves of the 1870s and 1880s were a genuine improvement over open hearth cooking, but they demanded constant attention. Loading with wood or dried buffalo chips where timber was scarce, or with twisted prairie grass in the most resource-bare stretches of the plains. Regulating heat by adjusting dampers through intuition built over years. Cleaning ash from the firebox, keeping the stovetop free of the grease that built up from daily cooking and which, if neglected, could catch fire with no warning. In summer, the stove made the interior of a small cabin nearly unbearable by midday. You cooked anyway because there was no alternative. The food produced on this stove was by necessity simple and repetitive. Cornmeal was a staple across the frontier in multiple forms, as a thick mush in the morning, as cornbread served with dinner, as johnny cakes if there was fat enough to fry them on the griddle. Salt pork, heavily preserved and intensely salty, appeared in nearly every meal as both a protein source and a flavoring, cooked into beans, fried in its own fat, or boiled with whatever vegetables the garden offered. Dried beans simmered on the back of the stove through the whole of a long workday, requiring nothing except the occasional addition of water. Potatoes were boiled, mashed with lard, or sliced and fried.
Fresh vegetables appeared seasonally and were preserved aggressively, canned in glass jars sealed with wax, dried on strings hung from the rafters, pickled in brine, stored in root cellars dug into the hillside or under the cabin floor, by women who understood that winter would arrive regardless of whether the harvest had been sufficient, and that the gap between what was stored and what was needed could be very cold and very long. Coffee was taken seriously on the frontier with an intensity that surprises people who think of it as a modern obsession. Green beans were purchased at the general store, roasted in a pan on the stove until they darkened and cracked, ground by hand in the small iron mill bolted to the wall or set on the table, then brewed strong enough to be almost bitter in a battered enamel pot. It was drunk black or with sugar. Milk was available if the family kept a cow, which not all did. Sharing coffee with a neighbor who had ridden a long way was a gesture of genuine welcome in a world where hospitality was also a form of survival insurance. The neighbor you fed today might be the one who helped pull your wagon from the mud next month. The matter of health on the frontier is where the distance between the 19th century and our own time becomes most viscerally apparent. There were no doctors within reach of most isolated homesteads, or if there were, they were days away by wagon, which meant that by the time professional medical care arrived, the crisis had often resolved one way or another. Frontier women functioned as the medical practitioners of their households, drawing on experience, on advice passed between women, on domestic medicine guides like John Gunn's widely circulated Domestic Medicine, and on the empirical trial and error that comes from having no alternative. Childbirth was managed at home, typically with the help of a neighbor woman who had experience, or a midwife if one could be reached in time. The risks were real and understood. Maternal mortality on the frontier was significant, and women knew women who had not survived deliveries. Infections that would be trivial today, a cut from a farm implement, a tooth that had gone bad, an ear infection in a child, were serious without antibiotics. Pneumonia swept through frontier settlements in winter and took people who had survived years of hard labor without complaint. Dysentery followed contaminated water sources. Typhoid was a recurring threat in places where the relationship between human waste and the water supply was not well managed, which in many settlements it was not. Pain management was improvised. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was available at general stores and used widely for everything from teething to serious injury. Poultices made from mustard or onion were applied to chests for respiratory illness, to wounds in hopes of drawing out infection. Some of these remedies worked, many did not. The line between treatment and wishing thinking was often indistinct, and the people doing the treating understood this and continued anyway. The isolation that defined so much of frontier life in the 1880s deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. In popular accounts, it's mentioned and moved past as though it were a manageable inconvenience like bad weather. For many frontier women, it was not. Letters and diaries from this period return again and again to the particular weight of days spent with only children and animals for company, of weeks passing without speaking to another adult woman, of the mental effort required to maintain equilibrium when the landscape itself, flat, enormous, silent in ways that had no precedent in Eastern or European experience, seemed actively indifferent to human presence. One recurring image in these accounts is of women going to the door of the cabin and simply looking out at the horizon, at the grass bending in the wind and the sky going unbroken to every edge of sight for minutes at a time before going back inside to whatever needed doing next. The sociability that frontier women constructed within these constraints was deliberately maintained and highly valued. A neighbor's visit, made possible by good weather at a free afternoon, might mean several hours of shared work, quilting, sewing, preserving, alongside conversation and the exchange of news, seeds, recipes, borrowed tools, and the kind of intimate intelligence about the condition of nearby families that served as the informal social welfare system of the community. Church, where it existed within a reasonable distance, was the other organizing social event, not primarily contemplative for many, but communal, a reason to dress in the better dress and hitch the wagon and spend several hours among other human beings in a way that the long week's isolation could not entirely replace. The town, when a frontier family came to it, was an occasion. For homesteaders distant from any settlement, a trip might happen once a month or less, a full day's journey by wagon, sometimes two, to reach a place that might consist of a general store, a saloon or two, a livery stable, a smithy, and a post office operating out of someone's front room. The general store carried flour, sugar, coffee, salt, tobacco, patent medicines, fabric, tools, and a rotating inventory of goods that had arrived by rail or wagon from supply depots further east. Towns on the cattle routes of Kansas and Texas, Dodge City, Abilene, Caldwell during their active years had a different character, louder, more transient, organized around the needs of the cattle trade and the men who drove it. A woman arriving in Dodge City in 1880 to collect mail and stock provisions would be navigating a social environment built almost entirely around men who had been on the trail for months. The saloons would be busy before noon. The main street would smell of horse, manure, sawdust, and the particular compressed energy of a place where everyone was passing through, and very few had any reason to be careful.
The category of frontier women was never monolithic, and the experience varied enormously depending on who you were and what you had. A woman who came west with a husband of sufficient resources, a man who had staked a claim with money to invest in a proper frame house, good tools, a team of draft horses, and the cash to bridge the years before a farm turned profit, lived differently from the wife of a man whose claim was marginal and whose resources were depleted before the first crop came in. A widow who had inherited a functioning homestead and was determined to work it occupied a different position than a young woman newly arrived from Ohio, married quickly to someone she had known only months, now in a sod house on the Nebraska prairie with 3 children and a husband who drank when the harvest failed. Race complicated everything further. Race frontier families, present in significant numbers in some territories, particularly in Kansas, where the Exoduster movement brought thousands of formerly enslaved people after Reconstruction, faced conditions their white neighbors did not, including active hostility, exclusion from certain towns, and legal frameworks enforced with calculated selectivity. Women who ran boarding houses in frontier towns were essential economic actors who rarely appear in histories organized around gunfighters and cattle kings. Running one meant cooking 3 meals a day for a varying and not always reliable number of paying guests, managing linens and laundry, maintaining some standard of order in establishments that might house men who came in drunk, who fought over card games, who left without paying, who arrived with vermin in their bedrolls. It was exhausting, skilled entrepreneurial labor performed largely by women whose contribution to the frontier economy is consistently underestimated. Women who worked in saloons and dance halls occupied the most stigmatized position on the social spectrum, though their lives were less uniform than the stigma implied. Some were in situations of genuine exploitation. Others had made a rational calculation about available options in an economy where female labor was systematically undervalued, and where the alternatives, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse for minimal pay, domestic service, or the grinding isolation of a homestead, had their own considerable costs. The frontier left its marks on the body in ways that accumulated visibly over years. A woman who had spent a decade on a plains homestead looked different from a woman who had spent those same years in a Boston parlor. Her hands would be roughened from lye soap, cold water, and the constant friction of tools and fabric, the knuckles enlarged slightly, the palms calloused, the skin around the nails cracked open in dry weather and slow to heal. The skin of her face would be weathered from the sun and wind, which on the plains was rarely still and in summer carried enough fine grit to be genuinely abrasive day after day. Teeth were a particular frontier affliction. Without consistent dental access, decay was common and untreated until intolerable, then removed by whoever was willing, the local barber, a traveling dentist if one was passing through, or a family member with a pair of pliers and the understanding that infection was more dangerous than the procedure. Sleep was rarely luxurious. The beds in most homesteads were wooden frames strung with rope, topped with a mattress stuffed with corn husks or prairie grass, materials that compacted over time, rustled with every movement, and were hospitable to insects in ways that feather mattresses were not. Wool blankets, heavy and scratchy with a primary covering, supplemented in winter with coats and extra layers of clothing pressed into service. In a one-room cabin, privacy was a structural impossibility. The whole family slept in the same space, heard each other, felt the presence of each other in the dark. By night, the frontier was dark in a way that modern life has almost entirely abolished. Kerosene lamps cast a yellow, shifting light adequate for close work, but inadequate for reading without strain. Beyond the lamp's reach, the darkness was complete,
No streetlights, no glow on the horizon from a nearby city, no illumination from neighboring houses, only the sound of the wind finding every gap in the log walls, and above the sod roof on clear nights, stars in their vast, undiluted, indifferent clarity. What the frontier demanded of women in this era was not heroism in the dramatic sense that word carries in popular memory. It was something more continuous and in many ways more demanding. Competence maintained under genuine hardship over years rather than moments. The woman who fed her family adequately through a drought year, who nursed a child through typhoid without medical help, who kept the household functional while her husband was absent or incapacitated, who managed the emotional life of an isolated homestead across the long arithmetic of seasons. She was not performing the frontier of legend. She was doing the actual work on which settlement depended, and doing it without the recognition that went to the men who drove cattle or wore badges. History tended to write down what men did in public. It tended to take for granted what women did at home, which is perhaps why the frontier looks different when you start reading the letters they left behind. The historical record of frontier women in the 1880s exists largely in diaries and letters, in the occasional published memoir, and in census and land records that mark their presence without describing their lives. What emerges from these sources, read carefully, is not a story of heroic suffering arranged for an audience that wants to feel something. It's a story of practical intelligence applied to conditions that were demanding in ways that accumulate, not the single dramatic crisis, but the weight of 10,000 small difficulties, the absence of comfort as the permanent structure of a life rather than a temporary inconvenience. The image the dime novels sold, the sunlit horizon, the wide sky, the romance of open country, was not entirely false. The sky was wide, the horizon was there, but so was the mud on the floor, the ache in the back, the baby coughing in the corner, and the bucket that needed filling again. She will pour the first coffee of the morning from a pot that has been sitting on the stove since she stoked the fire an hour ago. It will be strong enough to be almost bitter, and it will be exactly what she needs. Outside, the light is changing. The chickens are already making noise. There's water to haul, bread to start, and a fence post that came loose in yesterday's wind that will need attention before the stock finds the gap. The list is not written down anywhere. It lives in the body, in the hands, in the accumulated knowledge of what this particular day requires. She lifts the cup, she takes a breath, she gets to work.